Late summer 1868, the Montana Territory. The air was not air, but a shimmering curtain of dust and heat, vibrating with the soaring of grasshoppers. The sun, a white-hot coin, had burned the prairie to a uniform, brittle tan. In this vast, unforgiving landscape, Silas Croft, a man in his 40s, with a face weathered like cured leather, stood over the mouth of his well. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sharp creak of the wooden pulley as he lowered the bucket. He listened, his head bowed, waiting for the hollow thump as the bucket hit the packed, dry clay at the bottom. There was no splash. There had been no splash for 3 weeks. He hauled the rope back up, hand over hand, the dry hemp fibers abrasive against his palms. The empty oak bucket emerged, its staves shrunk and loose, the metal bands rattling. He had built this cabin, this life around this well, and this well was a failure. He looked at the cabin, its log walls warped by the sun. Inside, his wife Elspeth would be sitting in the dim, oppressive heat, rationing the last of the water from the barrel, water he'd hauled 6 miles from the sluggish, muddy creek. This failure felt physical, a cold knot in his stomach that the 100-degree heat could not touch. This was the second time the well had betrayed them. The first had been the opposite, a failure of ice. That previous January, a blizzard had entombed the prairie for 2 weeks. The temperature had plunged to 30 below zero, a cold so profound it felt like a living entity. Pressing against the chinking of the cabin, searching for any way in, the well, dug just 20 feet deep, had frozen solid. Not just a skim of ice on top, but a complete, impenetrable column of it. For 13 days, Silas had spent 6 hours a day with his axe and a kettle, melting snow on the wood stove. It was a slow, exhausting process that yielded grey, tasteless water and consumed a terrifying amount of his precious, hard-won firewood. Now, in August, he faced the opposite extreme. The shallow water table, fed only by the spring melt and infrequent rains, had simply vanished, retreating deep into the earth. The well, dug in the standard way, in the convenient low spot 30 yards from his door, was nothing more than a stone-lined pit. He had built it just as his neighbors had, just as the settlement guides suggested, yet it failed him in the 2 seasons that mattered most. He was living between 2 oscillating points of catastrophe, death by thirst in the summer and death by freezing or exhaustion in the winter. The land was teaching him a brutal lesson. Convenience was a lie. The standard way was a fool's path. He looked past his failed well toward the low, rolling hills to the north. The cottonwoods far down by the main creek bed were still green, their leaves whispering in the hot wind. They knew something he didn't. They were drinking from a different source, a deeper promise. He knew, with a certainty that settled over him like the suffocating heat, that he could not survive another year like this. He would have to find a new way, or the prairie would claim his small scratch of a homestead, leaving nothing but a dry hole and warped logs as a monument to his ignorance. He remembered the labor of that first well with a bitter sense of irony. He had arrived in the territory in the spring of 1866, full of the fierce optimism that drove men west, a belief that will and work could conquer any landscape. He'd chosen the spot for the well himself, pacing the land with a willow switch, convinced he felt a pull, just as the old-timers advised. It was a gentle swale, a natural collecting point for water and close to the cabin site. It made perfect sense. He'd begun digging with a pick and shovel, his shoulders and back screaming in protest. The first 5 feet were rich topsoil, then 8 feet of dense, stubborn clay. At 15 feet, he hit gravel, and the soil turned damp. At 19 feet, water began to seep in, cool and sweet. By 20 feet, he had a standing column of 3 feet of water. It was a moment of pure triumph. He'd spent the next week lining the shaft with field stones gathered from the prairie, fitting them together with painstaking care. He built a cedar well cap, a sturdy frame, and hung the pulley. That first summer, the well was a miracle. The water was cold, abundant. Elspeth had even planted a small kitchen garden, and the green shoots felt like a defiant victory against the vast brown expanse. The problem, he realized too late, was that he had tapped not an aquifer, but a temporary reservoir. He had pierced what the geology of the place called a perched water table, a shallow layer of water trapped in loose gravel. Above, the real deep bedrock, fed only by surface runoff. It was an illusion of security. When the long, dry summer reached its apex, that shallow table simply evaporated, cooked away by the relentless sun. And when the deep cold of winter arrived, the frost line, the depth to which the ground freezes solid, plunged 8, sometimes 10 feet down. His 20-foot well with its shallow water level was completely vulnerable. The cold didn't just freeze the top. It crept in from the frozen earth on all sides, turning his precious water source into a useless cylinder of ice. He had followed the common wisdom, and that wisdom was designed for gentler places, for Ohio or Pennsylvania, not for this high, arid and brutal climate that swung between Arctic and desert. His neighbors were in the same predicament. Jacob, his nearest neighbor 2 miles east, was hauling water from the same muddy creek. 2 families in the settlement, he'd heard, were packing up, broken by the drought. The frustration ate at Silas. He had worked tirelessly, cut no corners, and built his well with skill, but he had built the wrong thing. The problem wasn't his craftsmanship, it was the entire design. It was a design that assumed the environment was mild, when it was, in fact, an active adversary. He sat on the edge of the useless well pit, the hot stone pressing through his canvas trousers. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, a war against heat that stole his water, and a war against cold that locked it away. Any new solution, he thought, would have to defeat both enemies at once. The insight he needed did not come from a book. It came first from the land, and then from the people who had learned to read it. He spent days walking his property, not as a homesteader, but as a student. He watched the cottonwoods again. Their roots, he knew, must plunge 30, 40, maybe 50 feet to find the water that kept them green while the buffalo grass crumbled to dust. They were tapped into the real river, the one that flowed underground, fed by the distant snow-capped mountains. Not by the fickle prairie thunderstorms. That was the first lesson. He had to go deeper, much deeper, but depth alone wouldn't solve the winter. A 50-foot deep well would still freeze at the top. He would just have a taller column of ice to curse. The second lesson came from a man he met while tracking a deer. He was a crow man. His name sounded to Silas like "He who sees the water," who was traveling through the area. Silas, through a mix of broken English and sign language, shared his plight, offering tobacco. The man listened, his gaze sweeping over Silas's land. He walked past the failed well in the gully without a second glance. Instead, he walked uphill toward a granite outcrop on the high point of the property. He stopped and pointed at a spot on the ground, a patch of hardy sagebrush that seemed a healthier green than the rest. Silas was bewildered. "Water? Here?" he signed, pointing down and then making a downhill motion. Everyone knew water ran downhill. You dug in the low places. The Crowman shook his head, then pointed to the distant mountains, then deep into the ground at his feet. His gesture implied pressure, water forced up from below, trapped by the rock. He was showing Silas a place where the deep aquifer, the one the cottonwoods drank from, was pushed closer to the surface by the underlying bedrock. It was the opposite of an intuitive location, but it held a hidden logic. The third piece of the puzzle came from the settlement. An old German stonemason named Friedrich Metzger had arrived, intending to build a storehouse. Silas saw him directing the excavation, insisting on a foundation far deeper than anyone thought necessary. Silas, desperate for answers, approached him. He described his frozen well. Metzger nodded, his eyes sharp. "Ja," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You build in the Yankee style. It is fast, it is cheap, and it is wrong for this cold." He described the Brunnen of his childhood in the Black Forest. "The frost is your enemy," Metzger explained, picking up a stick and drawing in the dust. "You do not just put a lid on the well, you must put the well itself in a room under the frost. You dig a large pit 10 feet deep, you line it with stone. Then, at the bottom of this pit, you make your well, the well cap, the pulley. It is all down there." He tapped the drawing. "The earth keeps the room from freezing. The snow on top becomes a blanket. You put the cold in a box, and you do not let it touch the water." Silas stared at the drawing. A well inside a cellar. A subterranean room dedicated to insulating the wellhead. It was ingenious. It was a staggering amount of work, but it combined all the lessons. The Crowman had shown him where to dig, on the hill to the deep water. The Cottonwoods had shown him how deep to go, and Metzger had shown him how to build a well house buried beneath the frost line. He would not just dig a new well. He would build a machine for managing temperature, a structure that used the earth itself as a shield. The plan consumed him. He spent the last evenings of summer by the light of a kerosene lamp, sketching on the back of a shipping label. He was not an engineer, but he thought like one, listing his failures and designing solutions for each. Problem 1. Shallow, unreliable water. Solution: dig on the hill, as the Crowman indicated, and do not stop until he hit a source so strong it could not be seasonal. He would aim for 60 feet, triple the depth of his failed well. Problem 2, freezing in winter. Solution: Metzger's subterranean pit. He would excavate a 10 by 10 foot square, 10 feet deep. This would be his well house. The frost line, even in the worst winters, never went deeper than that. The well bore itself would start from the floor of this pit. Problem 3, access. Solution: the pit would be lined with dry, stacked stone. He would build a small, tight-fitting staircase down one side. The cap would not be the well cap itself, but a heavy, insulated trapdoor at ground level, set at an angle to shed snow and rain, and covered with a thick layer of sod. From the outside, it would look like a small, grassy mound. The true wellhead, the pulley, and the bucket would all be hidden 10 feet below, in the stable, 50-degree temperature of the deep earth. The neighbors, when they saw where he was digging, were merciless. Jacob stopped by, his face a mask of disbelief. "Silas, you've been in the sun too long," he said, gesturing at the enormous square hole Silas was carving into the top of the hill. "You're building a cellar with no house, and you'll be hauling water uphill to your cabin to boot." Silas just nodded, wiping sweat from his face. "Maybe so, Jacob, but I'm tired of melting snow." The work was brutal, a singular obsession. Elspeth, seeing the grim determination in his eyes, did not question him. She hauled his drinking water, mended his torn trousers, and watched as the pile of excavated earth grew into a small mountain. He started with the pit. The first 4 feet were topsoil and clay, but then he hit hardpan, a cement-like layer that shattered his shovel handle. He switched to the pickaxe, chipping away at the earth, his shoulders burning, his hands blistering, bleeding, and then callousing into thick leather. He worked from sunup to sunt. He built a wooden tripod with a pulley to haul the buckets of spoil from the hole. It took him 3 weeks to dig the 10 by 10 by 10 pit. Then came the stone. He hauled hundreds of field stones, large and small, on a stone boat pulled by his mule. He was not Metzger, but he learned the art of dry stacking quickly. He laid the foundation and built the 4 walls of the subterranean room, leaving a gap for the narrow stairwell. The structure was sound, the stones locking together, a testament to pure, repetitive labor. Only then, standing on the hard-packed floor of his new underground room, 10 feet below the prairie, did he begin to dig the well itself. He reset the tripod directly over the center of the pit's floor. The air in the stone room was already noticeably cooler, the sunlight a distant square above him. He began to dig the bore, a 4-foot diameter shaft. Now the work became dangerous. He was digging in a confined space. After 10 feet, 20 feet below the surface, the air grew thin. Elspeth would stand at the top, fanning air down with a blanket. He'd dig for 30 minutes, then climb out, gasping, to haul the buckets. He lined the shaft with cured oak planks as he went, bracing them against collapse. At 30 feet the clay was damp. At 40 it was wet and heavy. At 55 he hit a layer of coarse sand and gravel, and the water began to seep, then gush. It was not the weak trickle of his first well. This was a steady, powerful flow of icy water, rising faster than he could dig. He scrambled out of the bore as the water surged, filling the bottom 10 feet of the shaft in an hour. He let it sit for a day. The next morning he lowered the bucket, and the water level was unchanged. He had hit it. He had struck the deep, true aquifer, the one fed by the mountains. He finished the top of the bore with a thick oak ring and built a heavy, tightly fitted cap for it. With a simple hinged door to lower the bucket, he mounted the new pulley to a heavy crossbeam braced against the stone walls of the pit. He attached the new, reinforced bucket and a fresh rope. Finally, he built the access. He framed a heavy trapdoor at ground level, insulating it with thick wool blankets and dried grasses between 2 layers of planking. He hinged it, fitted it, and then covered the entire thing with the sod he had so carefully saved. When he was finished in late October, the well was invisible. All that remained on the crest of the hill was a gentle, grassy mound with a heavy iron ring for a handle. He had built his solution, a fortress against the elements, but the real test, the one that haunted his sleep, was still months away. The prairie was biding its time, waiting to pass judgment on his work. The first test came not from the cold, but from the heat. The following summer, 1869, brought a drought that surpassed all memory. The creek dried up completely, leaving a cracked, pale scar on the land. The settlement's shallow wells failed by early July. Jacob's well was the first to go, a dusty pit of despair. His cattle, their ribs stark beneath their hides, lowed with a desperate, rasping thirst. He came to Silas, hat in hand, his earlier mockery forgotten. "Silas," he said, his voice hoarse, I don't suppose you struck anything in that mad hole of yours?" Silas said nothing. He picked up his bucket and walked up the hill, Jacob following. The prairie shimmered. The sun was a physical weight. Silas bent down, grabbed the iron ring, and lifted the heavy trapdoor. A puff of distinctly cool, damp air, smelling of stone and deep earth, rose from the darkness. "After you," Silas said. Jacob descended the stone steps, his eyes wide, squinting into the gloom. He stepped off the last stair onto the hard-packed floor. The temperature dropped 25 degrees. It was a subterranean oasis. "My God, Silas," he whispered, "it's cool." In the center of the pit, Silas lifted the small door on the well cap. He let the bucket drop, and the rope spooled out, faster and faster, for a long, satisfying second, before a loud, definitive splash echoed off the stone walls. It was the most beautiful sound Jacob had ever heard. Silas worked the pulley, and the bucket rose, heavy and dripping, full to the brim with water so cold it fogged the air. Jacob drank, letting the water run down his chin, and it was a moment of pure, religious relief. The well had passed its first test. But the true enemy arrived 5 months later. In January 1870, a blizzard, which the Crow would later call the Great White Death, descended on the territory. For 3 weeks, the temperature never rose above 10 below zero, and for 5 straight days it held at 35 below. The wind was a solid wall of ice particles, driving snow into drifts that buried cabins to their eaves. It was a perfect, lethal cold. On the 4th day, Jacob fought his way through the storm, his face covered in ice, his breath freezing on his beard. "Silden! Silas!" he yelled, pounding on the door. "My last 2 cows are down. It's frozen solid. I think the axe handle broke." Silas nodded grimly. He bundled himself in his heaviest coat, grabbed his own axe, and they went out into the screaming white. They staggered up the hill. The trapdoor, the grassy mound, was gone, buried under 6 feet of hard-packed snow. This was the moment. Silas began to dig, the snow squeaking under his shovel. It took an hour to clear the drift and reveal the heavy, frozen-shut trap-door. The wood was rimmed with frost, the iron ring frozen to the touch. Silas swung his axe, not at the well, but at the ice, sealing the lid. He chipped it free, put the axe handle in the ring, and heaved. With a groan of frozen wood, the lid popped open. A dense cloud of white vapor billowed from the opening, as if they had opened an oven. It was the warmer 50-degree air of the pit, hitting the 35-degree air of the surface. They descended. Inside the stone-walled room, it was a sanctuary. The air was perfectly still. The stone walls were coated in a thick, beautiful layer of white frost, but the air temperature hovered at a survivable 40 degrees. The well cap was clear. The pulley was clear. The rope was flexible. Silas lowered the bucket. It dropped into the darkness, and after a long moment, the splash came, sharp and loud in the quiet, frozen world. The water was liquid. The well was alive. The 10 feet of earth and sod had been the perfect insulation. The deep geothermal warmth, trapped in the pit, had fought the Arctic cold to a standstill. Jacob wept. They hauled bucket after bucket, saving Jacob's remaining cattle and their own. Silas's mad hole was the only source of liquid water for 10 square miles. Word of Croft's well spread with the spring thaw. It wasn't just that Silas had water, it was that his water was effortless, reliable, and immune to the climate. First, Jacob came not to borrow water, but to ask for help. That spring, Silas stood on Jacob's land, pointing not to the low ground, but to a rise near his barn. Together, they spent the summer building a second sunken well pit. The next year, 3 families from the settlement, having heard the story, rode out to see it. They descended into the cool pit, ran their hands over the damp stone walls, and drank the icy water. They left with charcoal sketches and a new understanding, the idea disseminated, adapting as it went. Not everyone had the patience or manpower for a full 10 by 10 stone-lined pit. Some built smaller, 6-foot-wide pits. Others, like Friedrich Metzger, improved on the design, building a small, permanent stone well house above ground, but then banking its walls with a massive berm of earth and sod, creating a thick, insulated barrier that served the same purpose. This banked well became popular for those on rocky soil where digging was impossible. But the principle remained the same. Use the earth to insulate the wellhead from the air. By 1880, you could travel through the territory and trace the path of Silas's idea. The old failed wells in the gullies were abandoned, filled with stones or used as refuse pits. The new reliable wells were all pit wells or banked wells. They were visible as strange low mounds on the landscape or as small sod-roofed structures that looked more like root cellars than well houses. The impact was profound. Families could now winter with confidence. The endless, back-breaking labor of melting snow was eliminated, freeing up time and fuel. Ranches could maintain larger herds, knowing their water supply wouldn't freeze or dry up. The region became more stable, less a gamble, and more a home. Decades later, agricultural agents traveling through Montana would document these unique sunken wells as a curious piece of local vernacular, a clever folk design. The origin was already becoming obscure, attributed not to Silas Croft, but simply to the old-timers who knew how to build for the cold. Silas, watching new settlers build their own sunken pits, felt a quiet pride. His idea had taken root, becoming part of the land itself. The genius of Silas Croft's design was its perfect understanding of the forces at play. He wasn't a physicist, but he had intuitively mastered thermodynamics. The problem with a standard well in that climate was threefold. First, the shallow, perched aquifer was unreliable, disappearing in a drought. Second, the frost line was deeper than the well cap, allowing the ground to freeze the well from the sides. Third, and most critically, the column of air inside. The well casing was directly exposed to the sub-zero surface temperatures, allowing the water to freeze from the top. The depth of the well, while crucial for finding water, could not solve the freezing problem. Silas's solution addressed all three. By digging on the hill and going down over 60 feet, he had bypassed the fickle surface water and tapped the deep, stable mountain-fed aquifer, which was immune to seasonal drought. This gave him his supply. But the trick, the elegant solution to the cold, was the subterranean pit. This 10-foot deep stone-lined room, sealed by an insulated sod-covered lid, was a passive geothermal engine. The earth below the frost line maintains a constant, stable temperature. In that region, somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The stone walls of the pit soaked up this geothermal warmth. When the 35-degree blizzard raged above, the wellhead, the pulley, and the water's surface were not sitting in 35-degree air. They were sitting in a sealed pocket of 45-degree air. The deep earth was insulating his well from the surface. The thick layer of sod and the inevitable blanket of snow on the trapdoor only added to the insulation, sealing the warmth in. He had effectively moved the ground level of his well 10 feet down, placing all the working parts below the frost line. He didn't fight the cold, he simply built a barrier that the cold could not cross. It was the same principle that allows a badger to survive in its burrow, a principle that modern building science calls geothermal exchange and ground source heating. Silas had simply figured it out with a shovel, field stone, and the desperate clarity that comes from failure. His well was a machine that harvested the earth's stable warmth to guarantee his family's liquid survival. Silas Croft lived on that homestead for another 30 years. He watched the railroad come through, watched the territory become a state, and watched the prairie fill with families. His own children grew up drawing water from the sunken well, knowing no other way. To them, the trip down the cold stone steps in the summer or the descent into the relatively warm, frosted pit in the winter was just a normal part of life. The well became a landmark. When Silas finally passed, a man in his late 70s, the homestead was sold, but the well remained. New families came, and they too drank from it, marveling at the simple, strange design. The well outlived its builder, and his children and their children, a quiet, functional monument to a man who had been willing to think differently. The story of that well is a lesson that echoes far beyond the Montana prairie. It is a reminder that the standard solution is often just the most common path to failure. True resilience does not come from imposing our will on the environment, but from observing it with humility and designing with its unforgiving rules. Silas had failed because he followed convention. He succeeded because he listened to the cottonwoods, to the wisdom of the crow, and to the stonecraft of the old world. He learned that the earth itself provides the solution. The deep water for the drought, and the deep warmth for the cold. His task was not to invent, but to access. The difference between catastrophe and comfort, between failure and survival, was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of 10 extra feet of digging, a pile of stones, and the profound wisdom of insulating the heart of the system from the violence of the surface. He had learned to build for the worst day, not the average one, and in doing so, he had secured all the days that followed.